once you start to implement it, use the community to ask questions if you are stuck on any particular point. So implementing it, blah, blah, blah. So the mandate for multi-factor authentication. In Australia, there seems to be a mandate for MFA, or strong authentication for everything and for everybody. And this is good, improves security. The universities are doing it. They're all jumping on board and going ahead, setting up multi-factor for everything and everyone. And users are in general accepting it. So they're quite happy to accept a second factor and see the benefits in doing it for their own security and privacy. Federated service providers are doing it? No. Are federated? Is federated service providers are doing it. So there's one that's doing the profile, and I expect there to be more in the future. I know the Australian Access Federation has a number of services that will require multi-factor, particularly where it's around sharing of human data, genomics, and that sort of thing. So for service providers, some service providers have implemented their own second factor, and they occasionally pop up. The federated auth is one factor, so your standard federation login is the first factor, and then they have configured their service provider to onboard users with a second factor. Usually it's some sort of app that allows the service provider to know that they've actually really got two factors of authentication. But the problem with this is that now most federation users will have already done their onboarding with their local university. They have to go and do that whole process again, probably with a different multi-factor option or a different multi-factor tool. And they'll end up having a case like myself where you've got 6 or 7 apps sitting on your phone to do multi-factor. Then you've got to remember which one applies to each service. And we'll have tokens required at the SP. So it's not really a good user experience. So they log in with the federation, they're sent back to their IDP to log in, they do their two-factor authentication or multi-factor, then they come back to the service and have to do another multi-factor. It's a bit of overkill, and users will get annoyed with it eventually. So why are service providers doing this? It's because the service provider doesn't know or cannot signal its requirements for multi-factor or strong authentication. So it's forcing the users to provide another local factor to meet its own requirements. So service providers, as I said, have their own requirements. They want multi-factor today. They want to know it's happening, but they don't trust or know that universities are actually doing it for them on their behalf. The other issue around service providers doing this themselves is its adequacy. Is their second factor secure enough? Is it phishing proof? How is the onboarding process done? Is it simple and seamless for users? And how do users refresh their tokens when they get a new phone or they lose their phone and have to go through that onboarding process again when they've already been onboarded? So there's a lot more work that the service providers will need to do if they want to run their own multi-factor or second factor authentication process. Whereas offloading it to universities who are also going through the same piece of work will make it simpler for them and again for the users. So the ReFed's multi-factor profile has been developed, and we've spoken about it this morning, to help solve this problem and to improve the user experience. The user has only their password and their university multi-factor to deal with. The service provider can require strong authentication from the IDP when the user authenticates, and the IDP will signal that strong authentication has occurred in the protocols. It's not just they've waved a flag, set up some policy. It's actually part of the protocol of the signaling of the strong authentication. And if an error is reported, the service provider can use its own second factor if it wants to, continue that process on, or tell the user that their IDP needs to lift its game. So the NIH, the National Institute of Health in the US, has done the second option of telling the user that their IDP needs to lift its game. So if we have a look at what that actually looks like, we'll go to this NIH Commons site. So I can try and log in to here with a Commons login. And over here it says login with Federated account. So I can start typing AAF. So that's my identity provider, which we saw logging in this morning. So I click on that button and hit the login. And off it goes. It's now asking my IDP, can we do a multi-factor authentication? And I saw my IDP pop up, but it didn't pop up with a username. It just said, oh, I can't do that. I'm going to send an error back to the service provider. And now this is the NIH's message to users who can't authenticate using multi-factor because my IDP hasn't got the signaling turned on. It says, log into NIH systems requires multi-factor authentication. Either your institution does not support multi-factor authentication, which is the case here, or your institution has not enabled your account for multi-factor authentication. Please contact your local IT department. That's we've got the link, which has actually come from the metadata, and saying go and talk to AAF support to inquire about the ability to support multi-factor authentication for your account. If multi-factor authentication is not available through your institution, you may also register for use an account from login.gov. So they do provide another option, but that doesn't really work for non-American users. And then they provided some other links about your institution support contact and some other stuff there. So basically, I can't log into this service because I haven't got multi-factor authentication at my university or at my IDP. Let's see. Where is that like that? Oopsie doopsie. So that's a problem, but at least it's a reasonable response the service is given. It's just not some random error message. It's a proper error message, properly formatted, and with information for the user about what they can do to resolve the problem. Now, in this case, they can't actually do anything apart from contact their IDP admin, say, hey, you've got a problem with this service and you need to get your IDP to get it sorted out. So the NIH is the first service to seriously implement the REFEDS multi-factor authentication profile as a service provider globally. And they did provide plenty of warning that they were going to do this. I think it was nearly 1.5 years or 2 years warning that they were going to mandate multi-factor authentication requirement for their service. And they actually did what they said they were going to do. And they have blocked many users to access, or for access from their server, many users from accessing their service, which has had a good effect in that many IDPs in the US and globally have quickly implemented the REFEDS multi-factor authentication profile. And in this case, it was about money talking. So NIH being a significant source of funding and of research data. So if the researchers can't do their work, they will complain and jump up and down and get their IT departments to figure out how to do the multi-factor authentication. And in Australia, we've had a number of researchers come to us and to their IDP admins about how they can configure up their IDPs to work for this particular service, because they actually need access to the data sets that are available there. So the implementation, there are different degrees of difficulty. Depending on your software stack, what software you're actually running will help determine how difficult the effort is to actually implement this at the IDP. So if you're using something like Shibboleth or Simple SAML PHP, they are a lot easier than any of the commercial offerings. And yeah, so everything else is at a different level of difficulty. And it also depends on what role you're playing. Are you providing identities as an identity provider? Are you running as a service provider wanting this multi-factor authentication? Or are you running as a proxy where you're sort of proxying through the request to do multi-factor authentication? They also add to the level of difficulty, with proxying being probably the most difficult. So real technical stuff. For a service provider, they need to add to their authn request an authn context class reference. So this is just a blob of additional XML that needs to be sent across the wire to the IDP when a user attempts to log in. The white stuff, which is pretty difficult to see on the screen, that chunk, the last bit here, that's a traditional standard authentication request. And all it's saying is, from this IDP service, I want you to log in and I want you to send back the response to the assertion consuming service URL that I've provided here. And I don't care what sort of authentication happens. If I do care, then I need to add this yellow blob, which is the authentication requested authentication context. And it says the context needs to equal https://refeds.org/profile/MFA. So the actual URL itself is the name of the profile that needs to be applied when the user attempts to log in. So when a service provider wants to authenticate, it sends the authn request to the user's IDP. Again, it generally doesn't at the moment include that authn class reference. So the IDP can do any sort of authentication it wants. If it does send the authn class reference, the IDP must perform the authentication based on the requirements of the context class. And in this case, it's the MFA profile provided by Refeds. And if it can't do this, it should respond with an error. And as we saw in that example with NIH, because it got an error, it can provide a nice user-friendly error message to say what the user can do. And obviously there are rules for the MFA profile. So you need to abide by those rules. You can't just say, I do it, and then not do it. That's not how the trust is built and maintained. So for service providers, SHIB SPs in particular, adding the authn class reference is very simple. You can just pass it as a parameter to the SHIB SP login URL. So a standard URL to log in would be the top bit there, which is just a request to service provider dot experimental cloud. That's a little test thing I've got /shibboleth.sso. And then if I tack onto the end a parameter, in this case, authn context class reference equals, and that URL, that will actually generate an authn request with that blob of stuff in it. So it's very simple to implement for a service provider that's running Shibboleth SP. And I expect it to be similarly simple for a simple SAML PHP service. But I haven't investigated in any way how you would do it for a commercial service provider yet. It's on my things to do list, which is fairly extensive, so it might take a while. But hopefully somebody else will also do similar sorts of stuff with commercial vendors or others and make their results available on the Refeds wiki. There's a frequently asked questions area and a set of guides and other documentation around the multi-factor authentication profile, where people are adding their information, their learnings to that site as we go on. So this SP software will do the rest. We'll convert that into the appropriate authn request. Yeah, check out the frequently asked questions or discuss with your local vendor. Sometimes your local vendor will have absolutely no idea what you're talking about. So it's a bit of a learning curve for everyone in this space. So guidance for service provider operators is a section in the MFA profile FAQ area, which will provide some guidance, but it still needs a lot of filling out. Dealing with errors. So if the IDP is unable to perform the MFA as requested, it can respond And if it can respond at all, it should respond with a SAML response with an error and with a second level error status code of no auth context. So it basically says, I can't do that for this user or for any user. And in the response, it will look something like this. It'll have a status error, a status section. And within that, it will have the no auth context. And the shibboleth service provider, and I expect the simple SAML service providers will actually deal with that nicely, or can be configured to deal with it reasonably nicely and respond with an appropriate error message. The SP should provide a meaningful message error message, and the NIH examples, the first and only example we have at the moment. And for the SHIB SP, you'd start looking at the session error.html file and extend that to provide the pretty error message that you want to provide your users. And having researchers complaining to their university to implement the REFEDS MFA profile is very powerful to get stuff done. Researchers tend to have a lot of sway at universities. If they want something done, they know how to complain and whinge enough that it will get done. It may take time, but it's generally a lot quicker for them to complain rather than an end to say you need to implement this. So it really a bottom-up type approach is most effective. For the IDPs, it's a bit more work for the IDP's administrators, but for the shibboleth IDP, it's relatively simple. You configure your MFA solution of choice. There's a couple that are available to plug into the shibboleth IDP. There's Duo that can do it. There's the Google Authenticator option. And you can also set up your IDP to do a proxy off to your on-premise enterprise IDP. That option gets a bit more difficult. There are some solutions that will help in that space. You also need to let Shibboleth know that it can do the REFEDS MFA, and that's a piece of config that's within the authn.properties file. There's a section in there which all you need to do is add the profile name saying this IDP does support this principle, which is the what it's called within Shibboleth. I'm not sure how it works with simple SAML PHP, but I believe it can be done. And I believe they have their own set of documentations on how to implement that stuff. And Nicole's nodding vigorously. So, but we don't actually have any IDPs that use simple SAML PHP in our federation, so we've just ignored that for the moment. Proxied IDPs. Here, not all enterprise IDPs are equal, and no two have implemented the authn context reference stuff in the same way, or in some cases at all. So some just ignore the fact that there is a authn context reference piece in the SAML standard and do it really, really badly. So I'll just go through some of them. Microsoft Azure, they've actually implemented and respond to a Microsoft specific context value, which looks like schema.microsoft.com/claim/multi-authn. So they respond correctly to that, but they have no idea what refeds.org/profile/MFA is. So they just don't do that one. So what needs to happen is that, actually I'll come back. So if MFA has not been enabled for a user, the user will get stuck at Azure, the Azure login page, and the IDP will just continually ask them to set up their MFA. But if they haven't been enabled to MFA, they will get stuck there forever and ever and never be sent back to the service provider with any error message. So they've implemented part of the specification, they've implemented it with their version of a context, but they haven't implemented the return with an error if I can't do it part of the specification. Okta. Okta will accept anything at all that you stick in authn context reference in your authn request, and then completely ignore it. And it will respond with a value that you can then, that has been configured in the IDP. So you can set any value you like to respond with, and you can send any value, and it will just completely ignore you and happily continue on. So it doesn't have, it does, however, set an attribute value to indicate what authentication type has occurred. So instead of using the protocol and the messaging that's built within the protocol, it actually creates a user attribute to say this user has logged in with multi-factor. I think it's got 4 different values that it can send back. But it's not consistent. So when a user goes to first log in and they get the multi-factor, they'll get the attribute saying multi-factor authentication occurred. If they use that same session to go to a second service and just log in because they've previously logged in, so single sign-on has occurred, the attribute value is changed. And it doesn't say multi-factor occurred again, it just says that the password has been accepted. So it's very difficult to know after the first authentication if the second one is tied to that first one. So it's not perfect, and I'm still thinking of ways around it. And one of the options is to have 2 back-ended octas, one that does multi-factor at every authentication attempt and one that only does it the first time. If the user wants to, if the service wants to have multi-factor, then it can be configured to hit the one that has multi-factor turned on permanently. So every authentication requires multi-factor authentication, but that's not very user-friendly. So there's some, it's a bit messy, but we could make that one work. Google will accept any value at all in the authent context, and again, completely ignore it. And in this authenticator, will respond with unspecified. So it doesn't tell you anything about what happened at the authentication event, even though you've asked for a specific value to be, or a specific profile to be enabled. There's not much we can do with that, apart from have the organization provide some sort of statement that MFA has been enabled for everybody by default, and that all users cannot disable it. Is that acceptable? Yep. So having something written on paper, the university signs that and everybody's doing it, then that will be acceptable. And then your shibboleth IDP that sits in front of that can say, don't care what you can do, I'm just going to report back that MFA has occurred for you. But it's not foolproof and it's dodgy. Ping Federate can be configured to accept specific authentication context and respond with the same value. And I'm actually working with one of the universities in Australia that has Ping Federate to see if it can deal with multiple values. So you can send different authentication contexts from the service provider. How Ping Federate deals with those, I'm not sure. And does it really indicate that MFA has occurred? So need to investigate that further. Others, again, more investigations required by us to see if they can actually do the MFA signaling correctly, or do we have to come up with a policy-based approach to say, has the university turned it on for this service for all users who can potentially use it? Ones that we need to deal with are the F5 Authenticator and Oracle's IDP. The other one, which is interesting, is Cypherize, which is actually using passwordless auth. So it's not multi-factor, but they tell us that it's stronger than multi-factor authentication. But at the moment, the Refed's multi-factor profile doesn't actually deal with those types of authentication processes. And that all needs to be clarified. The other thing that we need to do, and you should also provide, is some sort of test tool to allow an IDP to verify that multi-factor signaling is occurring correctly. So your federation should provide such a tool where the IDP can test the MFA configuration or the MFA signaling configuration. I've built a very basic tool, which looks like this. Pretty hard to look at, but it gives you a whole bunch of different options. So I can do a login with no restrictions. I can do a login where it requires a password only, or I can ask it to do a password protected transport. So password sent across the wire encrypted. I can do one with MFA, refeds MFA, do refeds SFA, single factor authentication, or password was protected. And they're actually in order. So it tries to do the first one it finds. If it can't, it then falls back to the second, then the third, then the fourth. And it will then hopefully respond with what type of password or type of authentication actually occurred. Then I have a couple of others, which is, this is the one that's of most interest, is you must do multi-factor authentication. So if we hit that one, and this is in our test environment, so it looks the same, but I actually haven't logged into our test environment, so I have to do that. And again, this time I won't be able to authenticate, and I haven't actually configured the service provider with a nice error message. So this is the sort of error message that you'll get if the service provider hasn't been configured to provide a pretty error message. Basically, it's saying that SAML response reported an IDP error, and the IDP error in its substatus is saying no authn context was available to actually be processing that authentication event. So that's the error you get back. Should be able to take that and produce a pretty error message. And when we actually do a proper tool for our users for this, we will make it so it has that error message, a nice error message, and links off to our knowledge base and other information about how to implement your multi-factor at your institution. And I'm hoping that our development team will add this feature to our attribute validator tool. Just a simple tool that reflects all of the user's attributes. Should also be able to reflect what sort of authentication event occurred. Refeds has a single factor profile. Single factor profile specifies requirements that an authentication must meet in order to communicate the usage of the single factor authentication profile. Uses exactly the same mechanisms for signaling as the multi-factor, using the authn context class reference. It's just got a slightly different value. It's got single factor on the end rather than multi-factor. And it has a focus on strong passwords and how they are delivered to the end user, how you actually provide those credentials out to the end user. I'm unsure as if there's actually been any uptake of this profile. So I'll fling this to Nicole.
No, it's one of those things that I think people thought was really necessary on paper when they were thinking about it logically, and it does logically make sense.
Yep.
But there has been a strong use case for it.
Yeah. And I think one of the issues, if we were to push it harder, would be that everybody does their passwords differently. They'll have different strengths, they'll have different expiry times. And it's like trying to herd that bunch of cats into something that they're probably not happy with if it's not meeting their current setup for passwords. So I don't know if this one has much life. So your thoughts and any questions about setting up multi-factor or having your federation support your universities set up multi-factor authentication in your nation? It's a fun process. We'll be turning on a bunch of them for our Azure users or Azure customers soon, because that one's relatively straightforward.
So, Terry, I have a question. What about the users or the universities that are using like Google directory or Azure Ready? They have their own multi-factor authentication system. So if the university administrator turns on that multi-factor authentication, does that secure this parameter in the same way, or is it different?
It's turning it on's only part of the story. It's the actual implementing of the ability to signal and to respond to the signal from a service provider by the IDP. So turning it on is great, but the protocols need to be enabled to signal that fact that a multi-factor authentication has occurred. So with Azure, it's relatively straightforward. If you're using a proxy to sit between the Federation and your Azure. For Google, as I said, they don't have any way of doing that signaling effectively. So it's really going to have to be a policy-based approach where you say, has this university turned on multi-factor in Google for all of its users? If so, then you can configure the proxy to say, yes, respond with a successful multi-factor authentication. So just turning it on is not enough. You need to actually think about how to signal it.
Okay.
But if you actually go and have a look at the multi-factor authentication profile itself, it'll go into a bit more detail about how to do that. And the Shibboleth IDP configuration or website also has a few guides on how to set up an IDP to signal the multi-factor authentication, specifically for Azure and Duo. For others, we're going to have to work it out ourselves. Okay, so no more questions on that one. Let's move on to the next fun topic, which will be that one. We got 1 point. Assurance. So advanced identity management assurance, part 1. So what is assurance and why is it so important? Who is responsible for doing the assurance stuff? And at the end of the day, I'd like to have a discussion within the room about any of the cultural issues for the Asia Pacific region around assurance, because most of this stuff has been developed in Europe and the US, but I'm not sure if there's been any thought about any of the cultural issues that might appear for folk within our region. It may not be, but it's good to know, to work it out. So what is assurance and why is it so important? It's to manage the risk related to the access control of services. The relying party of the research and education federations need to make decisions on how much trust the assertion made by the identity provider and their back-end credential service provider. This presentation will introduce the ReFed's assurance framework for assurance and its expression using common identity federation protocols. Basically sticking values into an attribute, which is a lot easier than sticking values into the assurance start or the authent context. So it's about risk management, assurance frameworks, this framework, and access control to services. ReFeds have developed an assurance framework for assurance and its expression using the Common Identity Federation process. And there's a link there which will take you straight to the framework for more information. There's a version 2 that's very much on the way to us, but this will be talking mainly about version 1. So why do we have an assurance framework? It's to satisfy the needs of the Research and Education Federation for a common lightweight set of assurance specifications. Now, these specifications are different from the multi-factor assurance, which is dealing just with your credentials and how you log in. This is more about who you are, improving that, and some other information about identity uniqueness and attribute freshness. This profile allows a relying party to make decisions on access based on the actions that have occurred at the CSP or the IDP. The assurance of the authentication is not covered, but it's covered by the multi-factor, which we've spent this morning talking about. So, identify uniqueness. When you log into something, generally your IDP will respond with some attributes or information about you. And some of those attributes will be identifiers that identify you uniquely globally. So the identify uniqueness is about a method to communicate to the relying party that a user's identifier, such as their login name, is unique and is only bound to one identity. So my unique ID for the Australian Access Federation is AAF-Smith. Don't know why I put the AF in the front of it, but that happened. And that's bound to me. It's only me. I own that identifier and nobody else does. But what happens when I leave the AF? Will that be reused or reissued to somebody? So the following attributes, if provided, must have the following properties. So the user's identifier represents a single natural person. So AF Smith represents me and only me. The CSP can contact a person to whom the identifier is issued. So the AF runs the IDP for the AF, and I'm part of the AF, so it's fairly easy for someone at the AF to contact me because I'm generally in the office. I have an email address, they know my phone number, so they can contact me fairly easily. And if I've done something wrong, then that's how they can get to me. And finally, and probably the most important, is that the identifier is not reassigned. So when I leave the AF, my username is never reassigned to somebody else. So if John Smith were to join the AF, he would not get the username of AAF-Smith. That one's used, done and dusted, it's gone. He'd probably get AAF or John Smith or something completely unique to himself. The attributes that we're really concerned about having these particular attributes or these properties are the SAML2 persistent name identifier, the subject ID, the pairwise ID, and the OpenID Connect sub. So they're basically technical attributes about people, and they need to meet these particular rules. And if they do, then the IDP can assert that identifier uniqueness for this particular user is good. Beyond that, there is uniqueness about the eduperson principal name, or the EPPN, which for me is Smith. Actually, should be AAF-Smith. So I'm getting lazy. Smith at aaf.edu.au is my EPPN, and it's generally a human readable identifier whose reassignment practices is generally unspecified. So universities will potentially reissue or reuse that same identifier for new users as they come along if the old user or owner of that identifier has gone. Hopefully that won't happen, and that makes our life a whole lot easier. But to assist the relying parties and the service providers to use the EPPN, the following information can be provided about its uniqueness. The first option is to say that the EPPN is unique and not reassigned. So it basically meets the rules of those other identifiers. And you can say that that is the case. And for Australian universities, we're trying to set them all up so that that is the case, that the EPPN is never reassigned and it's always unique. The other option is that it can be unique, but reassigned after 1 year's grace. So if I leave today, the AF, my username can't be reassigned to anybody for 1 year. After a year, they can do what they like with it. We're trying to avoid that because that gets messy and it makes it harder for the service providers to deal with. So as I said, we're trying to aim for all of our IDPs to have an EPPN that is unique and never reassigned. And most of our universities are complying with that. I think there's only one that's a bit of a pain, but shall move on. The next part of the puzzle is identity proofing and authentication issuance, renewal, and replacement. So there are 3 options here with another local enterprise for those who are really keen. It's based on identity proofing and credential assurance, renewal and replacement quality from a number of international standards. The Katana assurance levels, the IGTF levels, or the EIDAS assurance levels. So those are 3 different standards you can pick and choose from. And you need to dig through those and have a look at how each university does its processing and make an assessment to say, are your processes at a low level, at a medium level, or at a high level? This is going to change with version 2, and there's now in version 2 there's a specification. The specification has a table of requirements for each level, and there was a consultation period which I believe is closed.
Yeah, we extended it for a short period of time, but it isn't.
Yep. And in there they have a table of normative IAP criteria, and this is going to be really hard, as far as I can tell, for institutions to work through. I've been discussing this with a number of universities. Most recently on Thursday last week, I was at the University of New South Wales, and they have different processes for their staff and their students. The processes themselves aren't run by the IT team or the identity management team. They're generally run for staff by the HR team or HR department. And for students, they're run by the student system people. So you've got different organizational areas in your organizations that are responsible for verifying that the user or the student or the staff member is who they say they are when they join the organization. And they will generally have different processes for doing that, and they will be inconsistent. So there's a lot of work just to understand if the university for their various organizational parts meet the various criteria. The next part of it is the attribute quality and freshness. And this describes the requirement for the quality and freshness of attributes. And this is specifically around the EduPerson affiliation, the EduPerson scoped affiliation and the EduPerson primary affiliation. Now in Australia, we don't use the primary affiliation at all, so that doesn't matter. We can ignore that one. The other part of the thing is that it's limited to the values faculty, student, and member, which is interesting. And I think I'll talk about that in the next slide, but that is going to make it interesting for Australia because we don't actually use faculty. We use staff and employee. By a few use employee, but nobody uses faculty, which will be interesting for us to deal with. Or we can just ignore this one because it's also, yeah, I'll come back to that. The values that can be asserted are based on your exiting processes of your university. So EPA-1M means that the values in these particular attributes, the affiliation attributes, reflect that the user may be leaving within the next 31 days. So you need to know in the future somehow that lecturer Fred is going to be leaving the university and within 31 days of the last time he authenticated. With the 1D, it's the user's departure will be within 1 day. I'm not sure how meaningful this will actually be or how universities will actually implement it. It's very, for want of a better word. Not criticizing the guys who put this together, but...
No, I know what you mean. I find that the time frame
based stuff is
weird. I mean, it's so arbitrary. I think, but yeah.
And if a user logs in 2 months before they're going to leave and never logs in again, the service provider will have no idea.
Yeah.
So it's, I just find this just sends chills up and down my spine when I look at this one. So we're going to try and ignore it. So this is really about the onboarding process for users and what processes are in place at your universities to accomplish that onboarding and getting users their credentials and accessing services. The framework splits the assurance into the three following orthogonal components, which I've talked about: the identifier uniqueness, identifier assurance, and attribute assurance. And the assurance of the authentication is still covered by this as multi-factor stuff. So for the onboarding journey, for a new student, for a new employee, or for a new visitor, a person is about to be offered a position within your organization. As part of the onboarding process, activities similar to those described here are undertaken to achieve the specific levels of assurance. So when you have a new staff member, your HR team or whoever it is who's appointing that person will probably do some sort of identity verification, checking that their passport's correct, maybe doing a police check of their background, all those sort of stuffs to verify that the person is who they say they are when you employ them. It should be based on a face-to-face meeting, so you'll generally have some sort of interview process when the new employee is starting. And at that point, you can start the identity validation stuff. I know the University of New South Wales, they actually, when they're appointing a new person, have a process where they can say, I want various levels of identity checks. So they can basically checkbox or list of options: police check, license check, other sort of checks like that. They can request occur before that a person is actually appointed to the university. And it will also depend on what level of work. So you wouldn't do that for a cleaner, but you might do that for a high-profile professor coming into your institution. The next step is that the identifiers are assigned to the user. So you've got them on, you've employed them, they need their email address set up, they need their username set up, and other identifiers created and issued to them. We are trying to, and have been fairly successful in ensuring that these identifiers are unique and they're not going to change over time and never be reassigned. Changing over time type things can occur if you start issuing credential or usernames that are based on a person's surname. And some of our universities do that. And that can be challenging. So we've actually asked some of those to create a second unique identifier for each user. And generally, that second identifier, the user doesn't really know what it is, but they don't need to. It's just a magic number that's assigned to them. The next step is about issuing the credentials. How do you actually say, here's your password, here's how you enroll for multi-factor authentication. And those processes need to be up to spec or up to speed that you're actually issuing the credentials to the right person. So you're not issuing credentials to someone who just comes along and says, hey, I'm Fred, I'm here to get my username. You need to actually do some sort of verification again when those credentials are issued. Once all that stuff's happening, the user can happily go off and access services that are available to them, both locally and within the Federation. Encircling all of that stuff is site security or security mechanisms and processes that are in place to ensure and protect the systems and credentials used by the users. These mechanisms must be well documented and maintained. So there's a lot of best practice security stuff that universities need to be undertaking, and being part of Certify is just one of those many activities. So we're starting to have this conversation with our universities about getting your users onboarded and having good practices on doing their identity assurance, issuing their credentials, and making sure their identifiers are unique. Nobody said no yet, but they all realise that it's going to be a long journey for them.
Is this one of your?
Yeah, I did this one. You can have it if you like. What's next? Let me skip back to that. Oops, didn't play that game. Something else I wanted to talk. No, it's good. Doesn't matter. So version 2 is coming soon. Assurance Working Group have developed version 2. The consultation period's closed. Did anyone in the room know that there was a consultation period for this particular activity? Anybody apart from 3 of us? So that's something that I groups and to be involved in the consultation processes. One of our guys, John, So the next section or next part that I'm going to talk about is who's responsible for doing assurance. Oh, okay. You can't see it here yet. There we go. Okay, back on the air, sort of, I think. We're good to go? Okay. So this short talk's really about who's going to be doing all the work. So most of the work with complying with the ReFeds assurance framework will fall to the identity providers in your federation. So we'll investigate what the activities IDPs should be undertaking and how the federation operators can assist. So we've seen this onboarding journey. I won't go through that again, but we'll go into in more detail. So identity verification. This will generally fall to your HR department or your staff or student admin for students. There's some other folks that need to be considered who don't actually fall into either of those systems. They're contractors, your visiting academics, and your alumni. And, do you need to do the stuff for these guys? And some of them you will. Like I'm a contractor for many universities. They just trust me, but I don't know why. But they should actually be doing some sort of identity verification of myself when I go and do work for them. And I think a lot of them are starting to think about this stuff as well. The level of assurance will vary depending on the affiliation and the services. So low to none for students is probably acceptable initially. Most students won't be accessing services that require high levels of identity assurance, unless they're research students, and then they're starting to access research data sets where you might need to step them up through credentialing assurance, also identity assurance processes as they start to access or need access to those data sets. Medium and high is really for your researchers, and it's really going to be based on what services they want to access. Again, if it's genomics data sets or data sets from highly valuable equipment or expensive stuff, then high to medium or high will probably be required. There's also another level, which is your local enterprise, and this is really for your organizations to determine. And I'll leave that to you as your own piece of work to understand what local enterprise is all about. And you need to consider the consistency of the processes for all. And generally, it won't be consistent. Staff will generally have a different process for assurance or identity verification to students. In Australia, we have students starting to need to get a government ID to actually participate and study at a university. When they get that ID, they actually have another process of identity verification, which is government-based. And it's a very strong process. It's a 4-step type thing where you're providing your passport or your driver's license, you're taking an image of yourself, which is scanned automatically, and the government will determine that it's you. And it's a very nice process. I've been through it once or twice to get my Gov ID. It only took a few minutes, and it seems to work very well. So we may be able to just sort of leapfrog all the students straight to high if we can leverage that external process that they've gone through. So Other things that universities are considering when doing identity verification is secure storage of personal identification or identity information, PII. Identity details like government issued identifiers, images, or credential documents. Universities are very scared of keeping that information for any period of time. Even having it for a few days, they're worried that it will disappear or get stolen. So they're actually looking for options to outsource the problem to somebody else. Using a third-party identity proofing system. And we now have a number of those in Australia. The issue is, how do we connect the universities through to those identity proofing systems? We also have the issue of catering for international students and visitors. How do we deal with those who don't have an Australian passport? They've got an international passport. They don't fit in with the Australian system. So there are some, again, third-party organisations helping to deal with that issue. And dealing with contractors and other externals that have short-term access requirements for the university. They're also going to be difficult to deal with. Getting level corporate systems into, so it should be getting, yes, getting the, so once the user has been verified, that data is stored somewhere. So it may be in the HR system, it may be in the student system. That data or that level needs to be transitioned across from the HR system, student system, into your identity system. So the identity system can then say, this guy has met the requirements for high or low, and I can then publish that out as part of the EduPerson affiliation value. So you'll need to get your IT folk to develop relationships with systems owners from the HR system and from the student system. And you probably already have those relationships if your IT folk are generating user accounts for them. You just need to get some more information out of those systems. The other thing is, do they actually have that required information? Do they store that on a system, or is it just done once off when the user or the researcher joins the organization and never stored on a corporate system anywhere? And do you have the integrations set up, and can you easily extend those, or do you have to go and do some more work to get that information pushed across into your directory servers or into your identity management systems? The identity assignment stuff, assigning a user's identity, the username, that should be easier and already in place, because your universities are probably already issuing credentials and usernames to their users. When a new staff or student joins the organization, any reasonable provisioning system will generate a number of unique IDs for the person. It'll generate a staff ID or a student ID. It'll generate a username. These identifiers can then be used to generate additional federation identifiers. In Australia, generally the user's unique ID is used to generate their target ID, which is the same value as their SAML name ID for us. It will be used to generate their subject ID and their pairwise ID and their EduPerson principal name. So if the base attribute we're starting from, the user's unique identifier, is got all the good attributes about uniqueness, non-reuse, and so forth, then these subsequent attributes that are generated from that attribute should also have those properties. Can the user's identity or ID change over time? And if it's based on their surname, if they get married or divorced or change their name by default, then they'll probably want to change their username to match their new surname. So try and avoid that process. But if you're stuck with it, a number of our universities are, we've asked them to actually generate a new identifier, which is some sort of numeric sequence, and start issuing those to all of their users. And most of our universities have actually found that they already have that secondary identifier for users, but haven't really used it anywhere. So they've now got a use case for that secondary identifier. Will the user's ID ever be reissued to another user? Simply, if this can be avoided that's the best. And if not, then do something to make it so you can have the identifiers never be reissued. We provide a hosted IDP solution for our universities. We've got about 60% of our universities using it. One of the things that we request them to do as part of the migration is to provide this unique identifier, which is never reissued. And as I said, we've had one university that's been a bit hard to get them to actually understand the requirement of that, but they're doing it anyway. So most will actually understand it's a good thing to have some non-reissuable identifier. If a user ID is reissued, there is a risk involved with that. The user with a reissued ID may have inappropriate access to the previous owner of that identifier. So previous owners has stuff in the Federation, the user ID is reissued, the service doesn't know that it's a different person because it's still got the same old ID. They may have access to data sets, to resources and stuff that previous owner had. So trying to avoid that particular issue altogether is probably the best way. Issuing credentials, consider how a user is issued with their username and password and how they're onboarded to their multi-factor authentication credentials. You need to ensure that it's the same person that you signed up at the university who's being issued that credential. And again, when the credential is renewed, how do you still know it's the same person who's come back and said, I've forgotten the password, can you give me a new one? You might want to have or let your universities tell them that they might want to look at some of the commercial vendors' options for addressing this, because a lot of the commercial vendors of identity systems have actually worked through a lot of this reissuing of credentials and have some fairly nice solutions. Attribute quality and freshness. This requires further thought, as we discussed earlier, and hopefully will require little effort if the affiliation values are accurate representation of the user's current state with regards to the university. So if a university student finishes today, then tomorrow they have their eduperson affiliation changed to alumni immediately. And that's where we're trying to get to. So everything is accurate on the day that the user logs in as far as possible. I think most universities are quite happy to do that, particularly with their alumni, because they want to get their alumni off their systems because they cost them money for licensing to Azure and other bits and pieces. The other issue for us, as I said earlier, is that the framework is only interested in the values faculty, student, and member. In Australia, we don't use the faculty value, we use staff value to say that this person's a staff member rather than a faculty member. And most of our universities don't populate faculty. So we need to work through that to understand the implications that may have for us. And for the member, that's automatically generated based on the fact that a person is a staff, student, faculty, or employee. So if any of those go away, that's automatically removed. So that one's always up to date based on the values, the other values that the user has. Site security, keeping minimal data about your users, only what you really need to know. Outsource the problem to somebody else is where a lot of our universities are looking, particularly when it comes to storing data about people, license, passport information, etc. Trying not to store that at all. And there are many other security practices and standards that are available. You'll find people are usually your greatest risk. And that's what we're trying to address here. Ransomware event at a local university. I spoke about that earlier. There was a potential loss of users' personal information, and that happened to myself. There's big loss of reputation for that university and others that have been affected by those data breaches. And it's an expensive hobby to clean up, so you don't want to do it too often. So who's responsible? In general, the university will be responsible for putting in place processes for identity assurance. Some of these can be outsourced. Results need to end up in the identity store, so they can actually be published out as part of the EduPerson affiliation value. And the IDP can ensure that the EduPerson affiliation values are consistent with the ReFed's RAF profile. All right, the Federation operator's role. This is what we guys do. We provide knowledge base articles, we provide webinars, and we have awareness campaigns that this stuff is coming your way. So in the AAF, we haven't written many knowledge base articles. We haven't done many webinars yet, but we have an awareness campaign where I'm basically going out and visiting each of the universities, talking to their IT folk and saying, hey, this is coming your way. Let's start thinking about it now. Because in Australia, there will be services within the next 12 to 24 months that will start to require this stuff, and your researchers will be on your back to make it happen. So start thinking about how you're going to make it happen earlier rather than to wait until they start flooding in and saying, why haven't you done this? The feedback I'm starting to get is they're actually realizing there's lots of effort involved to do this stuff. Verification tools. Oh, sorry. One of the other things you can potentially do is provide a user verification tool or an API that will help universities do this stuff. To do so, there's lots of effort involved. You need to have a business model behind it. You can't do this stuff for free, and it needs to be 100% trustworthy. I believe one of the European federations is trying to build some sort of verification thing.
Yeah, that's oh my god, my brain is complete. There is. I will find the information.
Yeah, I know there's one crowd trying to build this stuff for the universities. Good luck to them, and if they open source it, great. But, I wouldn't take on this challenge unless you're really keen.
Except this is a commercial version, but it's no longer suitable for what they needed. I can't remember why. And then they'll have I'll find them.
Yep. So that brings us to nearly 3 o'clock. The break time, or is that okay? So when we come back from afternoon tea, I'd just like to sort of open it up to the room to have a bit of a discussion about assurance in the Asia Pacific region. And if there's anything that you think might be sort of a cultural issue for you as Federation operators or as university IDP operators that may affect the ability for you to roll out these profiles. But for now, we're going to have an early break and we'll be back for half an hour, I think. Just check my hoovery doovry. Okay. So it is 3, yep. So 3:30, Advanced Federation Identity Assurance Part 2. Okay, thank you everyone. Hope I'm not boring you too much to tears, but this is stuff that you'll need to be talking to your identity managers about, or identity subscribers in your federation that are IDPs. So a lot of work for them. But the timeframes are fairly extensive, so it's not a great rush to get there at the moment. Possibly that will change as more services, particularly the high-end services, start to want this stuff, and your researchers want this stuff.